we continue to trickle in?
Now we can.
Terrific. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is the final day of the Intellectual Humility Virtual Symposium. On today's program, Hal Roberts is being replaced by his colleague and co-author Robert Ferris. We're also going to hear from Maria Baghramian, Shauna Bowes, and if you have the stomach for it, me. Before Robert gets started, I just wanted to briefly thank our funder, the John Templeton Foundation, which made this whole event possible. And to invite anyone who is watching this video to go back and see the others which are posted on YouTube for the three previous days. And with that, I will mute myself, and Robert, you can get started.
Super, thank you so much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. Is my audio okay? Great. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And what I'm going to be talking about today is about research we've done in the United States on political discourse, looking at large-scale methods to understand what people are saying to whom and to what effect. A lot of this research is framed in the field by people concerned about misinformation. Certainly, that's not our only goal in carrying out this research, but it's a good framing for all of this. People have tried to look at this on a supply side by trying to understand the motives and the techniques for different people creating disinformation and trying to deceive people online, whether they be trolls, hackers, bots, or entrepreneurs. There's also a lot of researchers doing great work focusing on the demand side, trying to understand individual proclivities to be susceptible or vulnerable to misinformation or being led online. This approach is kind of in the middle somewhere. It's trying to understand large-scale processes that shape information flows in the digital public sphere. A lot of this work is based on the platform Media Cloud that was developed at the Berkman Klein Center and at MIT's Center for Civic Media. Pretty powerful engine. Anyone interested, go check it out, please, mediacloud.org. It's free and open source. A lot of this work in long form related to the US election in 2016 is in the book Network Propaganda, freely available online if anyone's interested in checking it out. What I'm going to talk about today is more recent work, which is looking at political discourse in the United States in 2020 in the run-up to the more recent election. This was a remarkable time in US political times, starting from the strike against Soleimani in Iran to the impeachment trials of Donald Trump, all of this occurring during a primary election. And then you can see the curtain of the coronavirus epidemic taking over media in March a year ago.
Sorry, Robert, I think a bunch of us are having some trouble hearing you. Could you sit maybe a little closer to the microphone?
I can try, yeah, apologies for that. Is that any better?
That's a lot better.
Okay.
Sorry, thank you.
I'll try to not move my head. We'll see how it goes. Please let me know if it doesn't work as well. I was just describing how the coronavirus pandemic took over political discourse in March of 2020. So I'm going to delve into that a little bit and walk through the steps by which we create a quantitative structure to understand media discourse. One of the places that we've been doing this for a number of years, is to understand how different media sources fit on the political spectrum. And we do that by tracking the number of times they are shared by partisans on Twitter, whether they be on the right side or the left side. And by looking at the relative proportion of attention from both sides, we can situate each media source in the political spectrum. We have scores that cover, I think, 10,000 media sources now. So the coverage is quite nice. Another nice feature of this is that it requires no judgment on our part. It's entirely quantitatively driven. It's voting by Twitter users effectively. So you can see Fox News on the right, the Wall Street Journal center right, the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN are center left in the US media ecosystem. The next thing we do is we create networks based upon the interconnections of media sources. So this is a map of media sources based on the cross links between different media sources. The size of a node is a function of how many other media sources link to that site. So the New York Times, Washington Post, again, are at the center of this, and that's because many media sources link to them. The colors are from the previous slide. So people down the middle are green, people out on the right are red, people on the center left are light blue. And so that gives each one of the nodes a color on the map. Audio still good? You can hear me? More or less, huh?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. And the last piece to this is the location on the map for each media source is a function of how many other media sources link to two sites. So the New York Times and the Washington Post receive a lot of inlinks from a lot of other sources pulling them together. Sources that receive few links from the same media source are pulled apart farther in space. So what we can see from this is a disjointed media ecosystem in the United States. The center are the large traditional media sources that we're accustomed to, and right-wing media is off by itself. You also see an integration of media sources on the center, the green ones, with media sources in the center left, which are light blue, with media sources on the far left, which are darker blue. So that's an integrated media ecosystem. Again, the right is off to itself. The center right in pink is less well represented on this map. This is a long-standing feature of media ecosystems in the United States that has been true for many, many years. We do the same thing for Twitter, and what we get is we get an even greater separation in the network mapping. There's the right is off by itself, the Wall Street Journal kind of holding together in the middle, the center and center left and left off by itself together. If we look at Facebook, drawing similar maps, you get a similar structure. Again, the right is off by itself. The relative proportion of attention to right-wing media is higher on Facebook and higher on Twitter than it is compared to the in-link economy. So each one of these are different perspectives on the media ecosystem. None of them tell us the whole story in themselves. When you put them together, you get a more complete version of what we're looking at in this media ecosystem. The next thing we do is we draw up a chart of the distribution of attention across media sources. So this is based on the first map. And what we do is we take each media source and we put it into a bucket according to its location on the political spectrum, and we add up the attention within that bucket. So we're taking this map and all these people on the right, we're counting up all the attention to these sites, but divided into 4 right sections, and we do the same across the spectrum. And what we see is a distribution of media attention by location in the political spectrum. So coming into this research, we anticipated finding polarization in media ecosystems in the United States. So this is a well-recognized facet. We didn't expect to see this pattern. So if we were expecting more to see a symmetry in the polarization, that could mean a double hump pattern. It could mean a single hump, 3 humps, I don't know what, but we would expect to see the right and left look similar. This is not that. As you can see from this distribution, there's a peak in the center left where most of the attention is, and then another peak in the far right. If we look at Twitter, you see the same pattern. It's similar, but more pronounced here. Much more attention to the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and CNN. A lot more attention on sources on the far right. Similarly, Facebook, you get the same pattern. And what this shows us is the quantitative basis for asymmetric polarization in US media ecosystems. And we've spent years studying this pattern and the implications of this pattern through a series of different case studies to try to understand what is reflected in this pattern and what do we understand from this pattern. And there is a couple core insights that I want to start with. And one is based on an analysis of the historical trajectory. How did we get to this position in the United States? And who are the participants in the media ecosystems and how do they behave? What are their standards and practices? And the thing that drives almost all of this is that the historical media sources in the United States are found in the center and center left. And they're following the rules and the guidelines and the standards of traditional media in the United States, which is to try to be objective and try to tell the story fully and accurately. On the right, however, the most important sources that are gaining the attention are explicitly partisan media sources. And they are different animals. They are not trying to get it accurate as their first priority. The first priority is to provide a conservative-friendly version of the news as it occurs. And the more we think about that, the more we understand that these are really fundamentally two different things. They may look the same, they may have the same veneer, they may use the same media, they may wear the same dresses and have the same appearances on television, but fundamentally they are different beasts. One is focused on creating narratives, even at the cost of bending the truth, and the other is trying to hold firmly to the truth. And this infuses everything we see in media ecosystems in the United States. What I want to do is walk very quickly through a couple case studies and then leave time for questions because there's a whole lot here. So this is tracking coverage of different portions of the media ecosystem in March 2020. Over here on the lower left is the topics that receive citations from media sources. And we can compare media sources on the right here and media sources on the left compared to the overall media ecosystem. The black bars are coverage of coronavirus. Everyone is devoting a majority of their attention to the coronavirus. There's more attention being paid amongst media sources on the left than amongst media sources on the right. In the upper right-hand corner, we track cohorts of people on Twitter, those that support Trump, Biden, and Bernie Sanders. Again, everyone's focused on on the coronavirus epidemic in somewhat different proportions. How they're talking about it is very, very different. On the right, they're focusing on the response from the Trump administration, and they're being highly critical of it. The response on the right is why the left is wrong about this, how the Trump administration is doing much better than it's painting to be, and why it's all China's fault. So same topic, very different framing of the topic in these two spheres in the United States. In April, same actors, similar patterns, except you can see a drop off here in the amount of coverage that the right is paying to the coronavirus. And they're devoting a lot of their time to Tara Reade, who's a woman who accused Joe Biden of sexual misconduct. No coverage of that in the left, a lot of attention coming from the right. On social media, similarly, the amount of attention to the coronavirus is being dialed back, and there's a growing gap between the left and the right, between the Biden supporters and the Trump supporters. But on social media, they're starting to pay attention to relitigating the origins of the Russia probe related to the Trump administration's ties to Russia in the 2016 election. Little to none of that happening on the left. Again, we're talking about things in different terms as well as talking about different topics. The coverage from the left is almost all on the missteps of the Trump administration related to the coronavirus. Coming from the right, they're talking about Tara Reade, they're talking about China, they're talking about the New York Times being fake news. They're also starting to go after the sources of authority and spreading disinformation on the right. In May, we see an even more dramatic shift. You could see that the media coverage, the attention from media sources on the left is still predominantly on the coronavirus pandemic. Come May, conservative media has moved on. Less than a fifth of the citations coming from conservative media are going to stories about the coronavirus, and more than a third are relitigating the Russia inquiry into possible collusion between Trump and the Russians. The same pattern holds true on social media. It's even more pronounced there, where the attention has shifted almost entirely over to looking at what was called Obamagate on the right. And so a remarkable shift in the attention coming out of these different media ecosystems. I want to leave just a couple thoughts on the table. So trying to understand these media ecosystems, I started off by framing these as either a supply issue, a demand issue, or an ecosystem-wide issue. I'm convinced that it's an ecosystem issue above everything else. And there's a lot of great research that kind of is aligned with that. I think most of us certainly have an appreciation to the extent to which our knowledge of the world is contingent upon the communities in which we reside. Our understanding of the world is inherently a social phenomenon. And what this says to me, and having spent years puzzling over this and doing dozens of case studies, is that the explanations for the disinformation and the deep divide in the United States, the existence of these two parallel realities, is best explained by structural factors and historical factors. And that it's not explained by the differences in education levels or by different levels of media literacy or media savvy, but that it's in a sense an accident of history, that conservatives are trusting media sources on the right that are not serving them very well. And progressives and liberals and Democrats in the United States should probably not congratulate themselves when they're better informed than people on the right, that they're just fortunate to have ended up on this side of history in a sense. Lots to talk about. Let me leave it there and see what questions you have. And thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing, but I can come back to that if you want to look at any of that.
Terrific. Thank you so much. If anyone has a question, just type Q in the chat. I'll start. So I've read your network propaganda book, and I'm curious whether you see any kind of evolution between what happened up to 2016, which is reported in that book, and now in the subsequent 4 years. Does it look like things are basically as bad as they were, bad in a different way, less bad?
Great question. Hard to say they're not worse than they were then. I mean, looking at the narratives around election fraud in the United States, people in the United States are really living in two completely different realities. In one, there's no credible evidence of election fraud, and a large proportion of Americans are convinced that the election was stolen. And there is a very large and active media ecosystem that has stood up to propagate that misinformation. So there's been further radicalization and extremism and separation in the discourse in the United States, but it's part of the same trend. So the overarching factors that allowed this are the same. They have been the same for 10 years. But I think that there's a gradual kind of spinning out farther on the extreme that has led us to where we are. The unfortunate part about this is that this is very tightly wound, and the historic roots of this go back many, many decades. And I mean, the big question is, how do we draw back from that? Are there individual level interventions? How do we kind of bring things back together again in a way? And I don't know. It's puzzling, and I have no idea how to get there from here.
Okay. Jay?
First of all, let me just say that was just a fascinating talk. I was chatting nonstop with Philip about how just illuminating it is to see it mapped out in the way you had it. So, and it kind of resonates with everything I've seen and data I've looked at, but in a more powerful way. So my question was going to be the kind of question you ended up answering for Mark, which is about how we unwind it. And so maybe I'll pivot and ask you, is when I look at like the social media data, what it suggests to me is that there's a marketplace for this because of the clicks and engagements on social media for the far right. And it looks to me like a lot of this is being propagated even on social media by mainstream media sources. But does social media have like an independent role here by attracting the traffic, rewarding it, incentivizing it? Is there a way to engage in like regulation of social media? Or is it now, because of this historical accident and the set of consequences, like an inevitable, no matter what we do with that type of mechanism? Or do you have any sense of that?
I have opinions on that. I don't think social media is either the cause of this or a potential solution to this. So one of the theories behind disinformation is that it's social media, that it's an ungoverned place, and people are able to attract other people with hyper-partisan clickbait and attractive things that look right that aren't right. What we found in our research is that the roots of the current epistemic crisis were already in place well before the internet was even a popular thing. And the other thing at work is that how these things operate are very different on the right and the left. And if the internet and social media were the cause of this all, you would expect to see equal levels of problems on the right or left, or at least something close to the same. But there's no difference there at all. I mean, what we do see, we certainly see there is an appetite for hyper-partisan content on both sides of the spectrum. There's no question about that. People love to own the libs or own the conservatives, whatever it is. That's great stuff to have, whatever kind of partisan you are. the thing that's different is there's a society-wide, an ecosystem-wide, not across the whole system, but there's cultures and practices that constrain the sharing of things on the left that are not in play on the right. And so that's just very, very different. I think the sociologists, the structural sociologists who've been puzzling over society-wide kind of rules, how these take shape and govern things, are on the right track. I don't understand what to do with it, but I'm convinced that there's a lot going on there.
Okay, thanks so much.
Good question, yeah.
Thanks. Maria, you're next. And
thank you very much for a very interesting paper. I'm speaking from Ireland, where we don't have that sort of polarization in politics, at least in the Republic, not in Northern Ireland. But this is going to sound extremely naive, but one major difference between United States, Ireland, Australia, and America is the absence of Rupert Murdoch from our scene. I mean, it is very naive to bring it down to a particular individual, but sometimes individuals do play very nefarious roles. So I was wondering if you have any comments on that.
He plays a central role, there's no question about it. I mean, many people have said that we have a really bad immigration problem by letting Australian media moguls into the country, and we need to address that. But he didn't start it, he exploited it. So this, again, it's been in the works for many, many decades. There were firebrands on the right. You can go back to the 40s, 50s, and 1960s, who started this with the framing, probably with some justification that mainstream media sources are not kind to the right, that they tend to favor liberal viewpoints. But the real breakpoint came in the 1980s when Rush Limbaugh launched a successful radio station in the United States. And it was 10 years later that Fox News launched, but it was Rush Limbaugh that paved the way. The question I can't answer is, had Murdoch not launched Fox News, would the world be different, or would someone else have just come in and filled that same niche?
Yeah.
I don't know. Great question, thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting paper.
We have one last question from Marco.
This is such a fascinating platform. I need to check that out for sure. I was also wondering about the international dimension. Have you looked at other countries, and do you see similar patterns or totally different patterns in other countries?
I don't know other countries as well as I know the United States. There have been some studies that have tried to replicate this in other places. There's a great study by people at Sciences Po looking at French media ecosystems, and they don't look the same. There are segments, but they don't have this asymmetric polarization that we have in the United States. I don't know of another place that has this particular configuration, which I think is great. The more I've looked at this, the more I think that it's really detrimental, that it's a hard problem to unwind. I don't recommend it.
Thank you.
Great. Well, if there are no other questions, our next speaker is Maria. Maria, do you have a, sorry, I muted you. Oops. Can you unmute, Maria?
Yep. So I'm trying to share.
Yeah.
Is that working? Sorry, I've been having problems with this for the last while, and I checked it earlier. I'll just try it again.
we saw your title slide.
Okay. Oh, okay. You saw that. All right. Good. Okay. Now go to.
Yeah, that looks good. Just if you hit presenter view, it should be work great.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So thank you very much for inviting me to this series of seminars, webinars. I watched 2 of them online and one directly participating in the webinar itself, and have learned a great deal from all the various papers. So I have an apology. I'm a philosopher working in a multidisciplinary project, running actually a multidisciplinary project, but I do just philosophy. So you're going to get only philosophy with one empirical point there thrown in just for good measure. But it's I hope that can be forgiven. So this presentation is based on a paper, work in progress paper that a colleague of mine, Silvia Penizza, and I are working. Silvia actually has not seen this version, and I don't know whether she agrees with what I'm saying or not. Are you there, Silvia? Yeah, you can scream at me when you come to all the changes I have made. But we hope that at the end of this process, we'll come to some agreement about what we are saying. So that's Silvia. You can see her actually there. But this is a very, in a way, very sad photo. This was the last occasion when we all could get together before the curtain came down and we were at the lockdown. And that was the launch of our project, Peritia, which is a Horizon 2020 project supported by the European Research Council. It's a multidisciplinary project and focuses on trust in experts in the context of policy decisions. So the project was going very well. It's still going very well, but I'm having some doubts about the role of, I mean, the sort of push that I'm seeing increasingly, increasing levels of trust in experts. So in a way, I'm going against the trust of my own project today by talking about, well, maybe distrust or the value of distrust or allowing for distrust. I'm going to present this paper to my consortium in about 10 days' time. So I'm in a way looking forward to their reactions as well. So let's start from a point that where there is a consensus that there is such a thing as ethics of belief, that there is a strong value dimension to what we come to believe, how we justify our beliefs, how or when we are willing to modify them, etc. So belief in many different ways is value laden. And coming up with a belief is also value laden as well. So, and then the ethics of belief is nowadays more often than not, it's cashed out in terms of epistemic virtues like intellectual humility, non-dogmatism, and fallibilism. And that's all well and good, except that there's really, I think, very little discussion of the ethics of disbelief. Sometimes, I won't name names, people just start and say that, oh, I'm going to talk about ethics of belief, and it includes the normative elements of disbelief, but then they never say anything about disbelief. And that I think is a major problem, because there are good things about disbelief as well as belief that has to be figured out. So one type of disbelief is skepticism. So I'm just going to mention a couple of things about the value of skepticism. So standardly, we distinguish between global skepticism and then more local or domain-specific skepticism. And I think global skepticism is beyond normative issues. It doesn't pay off to talk about the value of global skepticism in these ethical or normative terms, because if you're a global skeptic, then you would you'd be skeptical about all judgments, including value judgments. So we are not going to get anywhere by talking about the value of global skepticism. But domain-specific skepticism, for instance, the type of skepticism that is motivated by Pärnamian arguments from deep and irresolvable disagreement, they do have normative features, and we can discuss their value or lack thereof. What is quite valuable, at least in my books, is the Humean mitigated skepticism. So Hume, as we all know, encouraged us to exercise mitigated skepticism. That sort of skepticism, he wrote, naturally inspires us towards more modesty, reserve, and diminishes fond opinion of ourselves, and also prejudice against antagonists. So the language is so contemporary. I mean, the words may not be what we are using, but the sentiments are the sort of sentiments that we echo when we are talking about need for intellectual humility. So that sort of mitigated skepticism can encourage intellectual virtues that I'm claiming are conducive to intellectual humility. But also, in addition, as Alan Hazlitt has argued, that type of Humean mitigated skepticism can be helpful for democratic governance by preventing extremism, dogmatism, and also encouraging mutual engagement. You know, you doubt your own views, but the other person also is doubting their own views, and you have more space for talking to each other. So Humean mitigated skepticism, I'm arguing that it is basically epistemically a good thing, in line with the sort of intellectual humility that's the focus of these seminars. But skepticism, I think, in some ways comes in conflict with, in opposition to, epistemic trust. Why is that? Well, skepticism starts with, depends on doubt, we know that, but trust, on the other hand, particularly epistemic kind of trust, involves putting aside doubt, because to trust epistemically, the sort of trust that's relevant to trusting experts, amounts to accepting or relying on the testimony of experts under conditions where one is not in possession of evidence or complete knowledge. So trust but verify, that Reagan was so fond of, just does not make sense. If you're trusting, it's because you cannot verify. So to trust, at least to some extent, is to eschew skepticism of the type that Hume was advocating. What about intellectual humility and trust? So there are different ways of characterizing the requirements of intellectual humility, and we have seen some of the ways very helpfully over the past 3 sessions. And I think at least a few of these are very much compatible with mitigated Humean skepticism, but one version of it is not, or one element of it is not. So to have intellectual humility is to avoid intellectual arrogance and to admit to fallibility, is to show willingness to doubt, it's being open to other points of views. And as we saw from Hume's quote, intellectual mitigated skepticism is helpful here. But increasingly in current discussions, and this happened today or yesterday, maybe in one of the comments, we see that trust, epistemic trust, is seen and presented as an intellectual virtue. And then also a feature of intellectual humility. Dormandy, in the Routledge handbook that Mark has co-edited, talks about that, and other people have commented that showing trust, epistemic trust, is a way of showing intellectual humility. And if that's true, then we have quite a bit of conflict or tension between Humean mitigated skepticism and trust. So why is it that we have come to talk about trust and epistemic trust as a virtue? So this is just a sociological speculation on my part, but I know that going back to, let's say, 1990s, people weren't talking about trusting as a virtue, particularly, certainly not trusting scientists. There were all those science studies people who advocated distrust in science, and also critical theory people in Germany following the Frankfurt School, etc. So distrust in science was a serious issue going back to the end of last century, if not before that. But political leanings have become a strong determinant of levels of trust in scientific experts, which is a very unfortunate development. And to express skepticism in experts nowadays is to signal some sort of allegiance to Trumpian or populist politics, or to make or to show that you are making common cause with merchants of doubt. So it's almost a mantra of liberal politics and moderate left-wing politics, sort of politics that I subscribe to, that you just are not supposed to express skepticism about experts. But I think that's wrong, right? At least I feel very uncomfortable about that nowadays, despite the fact that I got 3 million euro to study trusted experts in a positive light. I'm feeling increasingly uncomfortable with that position, because I think as philosophers, we should be quite self-conscious about the influence of politics on the way we frame our problems, not just about our political positions can influence our ethical points of view, etc. But framing is a different topic. So I have 4 concerns about trust in experts. Most of these arguments are well known, but I'm going to go through them and just to remind you what the concerns are. So firstly, the first concern is the argument from the loss of intellectual and epistemic autonomy. So the idea is that if you trust, then if you trust experts as source of your knowledge, you are running the risk of compromising your intellectual autonomy, the ability to engage in critical thinking, and you're showing deference. So there's a long history of this in philosophy, going back to Descartes and Locke and Kant. I've just mentioned them there. I won't repeat what they were saying. But there's also great respect since Kant for autonomy in the political and social and ethical domains. According to, for instance, Joseph Raz, an autonomous person determines the course of their life for themselves. And then in a parallel fashion, the autonomous thinker is supposed to decide the course of her thinking and believing, etc., with due attention to evidence. Now, the danger is that by simply trusting experts, you are compromising that ability. You're not sacrificing it completely, but compromising it. And then sacrificing epistemic autonomy would diminish our ability to make autonomous political decisions. I can argue for that point, but I think it's pretty obvious. The connection between the two is pretty obvious. Second argument is the so-called argument from democratic deficit. So from 1950s onwards in particular, there was this dream of a scientific estate that Price coined the term, and even John F. Kennedy was talking about this, that all our problems now are technical problems that experts can solve. We don't need the politics of left and right, etc. But John Dewey, to his credit, way back when, was already very suspicious of that. And the suspicion has been expressed by many, including Hannah Arendt. So the worry here is that the top-down reliance on a small group of experts leaves less room for participation of the citizenry in political decision-making. And hence there is a democratic deficit in having trust in putting too much trust in experts or being governed by experts. Thirdly, there is the argument from the social failures of science. This comes in two varieties. I'm going to cover both varieties in quick order. Firstly, the worry is that scientific knowledge that informs policy decisions is not value neutral. It's ideologically or socially biased because of gender, race, social status, etc. And also it can be corrupted by personal interests. Scientists who act as witnesses in court hearings, etc. It's very obvious that they have an interest, financial interest, when they are giving a particular type of testimony. Why should we rule out that sort of personal interest in other cases when we are trusting in their testimony? But that's not a huge problem, because we can maybe find ways of addressing these issues through increased vigilance and close the value gap in that sense, by ensuring that the scientists in whom we trust, at least on surface, are disinterested and are giving disinterested advice. At least they are not placing their own personal interests at the forefront of their advice. But there's a deeper issue here, namely the question of value gap in science itself, not what scientists as individuals do, but how science operates. And the value gap argument comes in three different varieties. All three of them are can be summarized as one argument, really, but it's good to go through each of them separately very quickly. The first one is the argument from underdetermination. I'm sure all of you know about this, the Quine-Duhem hypothesis that evidence never fully determines a single theory. So different theories can be justified by the same set of evidence, and then theory choice comes down to often unacknowledged epistemic and social value judgments. And a lot has been written on this. Then secondly, an argument that's fresher, newer, goes back to maybe Stanford in 2006, is the so-called new pessimistic induction from the history of science, where the argument is that at any given time, if we look at the history of science, we can see that there were alternative scientific theories, good and even better one than the ones that were adopted. And these theories were available to scientists at the time, but they were ignored. The scientists just could not imagine these theories. So it's sort of argument from lack of imagination. And then by a pessimistic induction, we have to say that current theories are suffering from the same fate, that scientists right now are just ignoring or not noticing alternative positions available to do. And then feminist epistemologists come in and say that, well, bias is what responsible for this failure of imagination, that sort of gender elements, racial elements, etc., stifles the imagination as needed. And then thirdly is the inductive risk argument. Marco, how am I doing with time?
You've got a couple minutes still.
All right. Okay. I'll go very quickly through this. So I won't go through inductive risk, but yeah. So again, there's inductive gap between evidence and theory, and that is often covered by values. And then fourth reason for thinking that distrust in experts is a good thing is based on historic injustices and that have been experienced in various ways. And I like to mention two empirical points here. So my claim is that historical injustices of science shapes levels of trust and justifies distrust. So what international surveys show that there's comparatively particularly low levels of trust in science in countries such as Japan and in Germany, despite their high level of education. Well, one explanation is that, well, they did suffer because of what scientists have done in those countries or to those countries. And also famously, the experience of some racial groupings, pulled through the famous Tuskegee experiments, justifies distrust in experts. So this is that in the one bit of empirical data that I'm going to show you. You see, Japan is last in this particular survey of trust in science in OECD countries, and US actually comes sort of below middle, ahead of Saudi Arabia, which is good for US, but Germany is very low as well. So what are we going to do about this issue when it comes to areas of science where we do need trust, namely climate science, for instance, and vaccine hesitancy? These are areas where public good requirements or requires compliance with expert advice. It's not just a question of individual autonomy, but the good of society at large and the planet at large requires trust in science or reliance, at least reliance in science. Also, when we are facing emergencies and we need more knowledge, skepticism is not a good strategy. Well, how are we going to react to this tension that I'm claiming there is in justified mistrust or reduced trust in expertise and need for trust? So one is to ignore the expert advice. I'm not going to go through that. Option two is more serious and should be considered, namely to argue that we should just stop talking about trust in expert as a normative requirement and replace that with a thinner notion of reliance. So Inkeri Koskinen has argued for that the ethical dimension of trust is such that it makes it not a very useful normative stance when it comes to science, where science needs objectivity. But I'm claiming that this is not going to work, because when it comes to something like vaccination, it's actually trust rather than reliance that's needed. Why? Because vaccination involves double vulnerabilities. On the one hand, we are taking a risk when we are being vaccinated. And second, there's a knowledge gap between experts and us in crucial ways when it comes to our knowledge of what is involved in being vaccinated. And these double vulnerabilities can be addressed by only if we show trust, while the main difference, as philosophers have argued, between trust and reliance is that reliance does not involve vulnerabilities. And then finally, my own solution, option three, is not to treat trust as an intellectual virtue, but to replace it with the dual requirement of one, demanding the trustworthiness of experts and policymakers. This is a well-known point. It has been made by Honora O'Neill and many others, but also to think of trust in terms of a societal collective requirement, or what I call producing or trying to produce a climate of trust. This will involve specific steps. At high level, we should not just assume that distrust is a vice or a sign of intellectual failure or indication of either knowledge or ideological gap. Then we need to place the onus on the experts and policymakers to be trustworthy rather than trying to make sure that the citizenry is trusting. And then at practical level, we need to creating a climate of trust, we need to acknowledge and address the societal injustices that get in the way of trust. And we can also reduce the epistemic gap between experts and the general public through citizen assemblies and similar measures. So that's what I'm working on now, the requirements of group trust, climate of trust, rather than just talking about individuals and why they don't trust. What can we do to make them trust experts? So I need to finish with this. That's part of the agreement that I have signed with the EU. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Maria. We appreciate that. If anyone has a question, you can type Q in the chat. And Maria, maybe you could stop sharing your screen so we can see each other a little bit. Thanks. So one question I have is about the sort of Kantian notion that you brought up of autonomy, this sort of sapere aude idea that you should have the courage to investigate for yourself and rely on yourself only. That sounds very nice and heroic, but one thing that seems to me to be quite common among conspiracy theorists is that they've done this and they've come to really crazy conclusions. So like if you talk to a 9/11 truther, they'll ask you things like, do you know what temperature steel melts at? And I'll say, I have no idea. And they will know, and they'll be right about that. And this is something that Kasim Kassam has remarked on, that conspiracy theorists often actually do know a whole lot, and a whole lot more than others about the domain that they're conspiracy theorists about, but they put things together in ways that don't actually make sense. If you think of the QAnon conspiracy theory, one of their slogans is "do the research," right? So they're constantly engaging in inquiry and relying on themselves to come to conclusions, and this doesn't seem to turn out very well. Yeah. So I'm curious whether you really want to push this autonomy line as hard as you seem to in the talk.
So the Kantian search for intellectual autonomy still allows us to make a distinction between good and bad arguments. When QAnon says do the research, they mean just go to our sources on the internet and look at those. But that does not mean research. Or when 9/11 truthers use a number of facts and then draw the wrong conclusion from it, they too are just doing bad research, and they are showing the wrong sort of intellectual virtues involved in autonomy. However, I skipped a bits of this paper, but what on the question of intellectual autonomy, what I would like to say is that there are ways of bringing intellectual autonomy in line with accepting testimonial knowledge. They are not necessarily incompatible. My concern is that even listening to some of the talks over the last few sessions, somehow there's just this assumption that trust in experts is so good that no one is really in a position to question it. While I think we should not forget the value of intellectual autonomy, because we need that elsewhere. If we want good citizenry who are going to address knowledgeably their right to think through political issues and to vote, etc., then we need to valorize autonomy and not just accepting on word of mouth or on trust the word of experts. Because once we start doing that in one area, we run the risk of just allowing that to come in and dominate other areas of our life as well. So I'm just going to say one more thing. I mean, recently this came up in a different argument session, like the role that we were happy to assign to Bill Gates as sort of an expert in health issues, and someone had nominated him for a Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize, and so on. And then now we see how his expertise is getting in the way of some very positive moves that Biden wanted to get involved in terms of transferring knowledge to India and other countries about vaccines. So power to experts is a dangerous thing, or could be a dangerous thing.
We have time maybe for one more question. If not, I will turn things over to Shauna.
Thank you.
Can everyone see my screen? Awesome.
Yeah.
First, I want to say thank you for having me at this awesome symposium, and I'm excited to have this opportunity to discuss my research on intellectual humility and political myside bias. In recent decades, open-minded dialogue has been largely absent from much of US politics. Dogmatism and cross-party antagonism increasingly characterize political discourse. These days, partisans not only disagree with those who hold opposing political views, but dislike or even loathe them for their views, a phenomenon known as affective polarization. In the last decade or so, studies have indicated that political polarization, and particularly affective polarization, has been on the rise in the American electorate. In addition to this problem of affective polarization, we're also seeing a problem of ideological polarization, meaning that partisans hold strong, certain political views. But beyond this certainty, partisans are increasingly deviating from the center, meaning that liberals and conservatives are unlikely to agree really at all on a wide range of political issues. When considering these problems of affective and ideological polarization, one potential consequence is political myside bias. And political myside bias refers to readily agreeing to or accepting politically confirmatory information, but denying, dismissing, and distorting politically disconfirmatory information. Political myside bias is likely highest in those who are already politically polarized. And there are three manifestations that are particularly well researched. The first is partisan bias, which refers to systematically favoring your own political party over the other. Selective exposure refers to selecting politically congenial information and ignoring politically disconfirmatory information. And bias assimilation refers to systematically favoring arguments in support of X over in support of Y, even if the quality of the evidence is the same across the two arguments. Now, as I just mentioned, political myside bias might be highest in those who are already politically polarized, and evidence suggests that this is the case. Research also suggests, however, that political myside bias might precede polarization and might increase polarization over time. Given this possibility that political myside bias might increase polarization, which in turn impedes much needed bipartisanship in American society, it is essential that we start to elucidate individual differences that might mitigate or lessen political myside bias. And steps have been taken to do just that. So for instance, appealing to a shared national identity seems to reduce polarization, or providing partisans with accurate base rates of the demographics in each political party also seems to reduce polarization.
Sorry,
At this time, it's unclear, though, whether these interventions produce meaningful changes over time or reach those who are already committed. And it's really important that we move around people's views on issues that they're already committed to.
Sorry, Shauna, can you reshare your screen? It seems to have gone gray.
Oh, it's just a blank slide.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So the first step, I think, here in terms of interventions is really to increase a willingness to consider that you might be wrong, a willingness to evaluate different political information. And this is where intellectual humility comes into play. And it might be a really fruitful path to explore in terms of partisanship and political myside bias. So we can think of intellectual humility as this virtuous mean between the vices of stubbornness on the left-hand side and gullibility on the right-hand side. So stubbornness is like dogmatism. I'll never change my mind. I'm certain that I'm correct. And gullibility is like Oberg's dictum, being so open-minded that your brain falls out. I'll believe anything. And intellectual humility sits nicely in the middle. I'm fully willing to change my mind, but there really needs to be evidence that I need to. And a preliminary nomological network is beginning to emerge. And indeed, scholars are contending that intellectual humility might be a nonpartisan personality trait, meaning that intellectual humility manifests itself to some extent in the left and the right. And we're seeing things like higher openness, higher curiosity, higher tolerance of ambiguity, low dogmatism, less self-righteousness, and less narcissism. So based on this preliminary nomological network, we might expect intellectual humility to lessen political myside bias. Now, what I've just referred to is a domain general account of intellectual humility. And as we know, with most, if not all, constructs in psychological science, you can also take a more domain-specific approach. So not just how generally intellectually humble are you, but how intellectually humble are you about X. And as our intuitions might steer us in a certain direction, some domains may lack intellectual humility more so than others. And I think politics is a great case example. It's challenging for most of us to be humble about our political views. Someone can be really high on intellectual humility in general, but still have a hard time being intellectually humble about their political beliefs. So by adopting a domain general approach and a domain specific approach, we can get more rich information on the potential relations between intellectual humility and political outcomes. So what do we even know, stepping back a bit, about the relations between intellectual humility and political myside bias? Well, again, based on definitions of intellectual humility, it really should be related to less political myside bias, and some research is beginning to emerge suggesting that this is the case. For instance, intellectual humility is related to less affective polarization and less same party favoritism, so less partisan bias. Some research also suggests that intellectual humility may lessen susceptibility to same party cues, and they looked at perceptions of flip-flopping. So intellectual humility was related to being less likely to pejoratively characterize a political outgroup candidate as flip-flopping when he changed his mind on an issue. And intellectual humility is negatively related to selective exposure, specifically being more likely to seek out politically disconfirmatory information when given the chance. In the present study, we really wanted to clarify the relations between multiple measures of intellectual humility and multiple measures of political myside bias in a really comprehensive fashion. So we included domain-specific and domain general measures of intellectual humility, specifically focusing on politics for that domain-specific measure. And for political myside bias, we wanted to look at multiple levels of information processing, ranging from the selection of information to actually evaluating evidence. We also wanted to clarify whether these relations are specific to intellectual humility as opposed to allied constructs. We specifically looked at honesty, humility, political ideology, and political conviction. And previous research suggests that intellectual humility does statistically increment these constructs in predicting things like affective polarization. And we wanted to see if that replicated with political myside bias. So here, there are a lot of paradigms that we included. So I'm going to present the results alongside the methods just so that we can keep track of everything as we move forward. We had 2 samples, both of which were recruited from Amazon's Mechanical Turk, and we had about 500 participants in each sample. To measure intellectual humility, we used 3 self-report measures. 2 were domain general, 1 was politics specific. The 2 domain general measures were highly positively intercorrelated, so we standardized those scores and combined them to yield 1 composite. And again, our covariates were honesty, humility, political ideology, and political conviction. And that conviction is how certain are you of your political beliefs, and ideology is how liberal versus conservative are you. To measure partisan bias, we had 2 conditions, and the order was randomized across participants. You first would read about either a Republican or Democratic candidate, and then later in the survey, you'd read about the opposite candidate. And here's an example. A Republican candidate, Michael, is running for US president. He is a 65-year-old Caucasian male, and he has served as a senator for 15 years. In a Senate election a few years ago, he supported a particular plan on tax reform, but now he supports the opposite plan. When asked about this change, the candidate explained that he has learned more about the issue in the past few years, which convinced him that his earlier position was wrong. His opponent accuses the candidate of flip-flopping just to get elected. So after reading the scenario, participants would answer questions like this. Do you think the candidate is flip-flopping on the issue just to get elected? Or rating characteristics of the candidate. How genuine is this candidate to you? And specifically, we had participants rate perceptions of flip-flopping, perceptions of the candidate, likelihood of voting for that candidate, and forgiveness of the candidate for changing his mind on a political issue. And we took different scores between the Democratic and Republican candidate, the absolute value, and the lower the difference score, the lower the partisan bias. They were evaluating the two candidates similarly. We can also evaluate partisan bias in a slightly different fashion. So what I just explained, it's really in your face. It's about a political candidate. We can also look at it in a more embedded fashion. So participants here read 2 resumes to select as a scholarship winner. And these are the 2 resumes. The only political cue here was under extracurricular activities. One candidate was president of the Young Republicans, the other was president of the Young Democrats. Participants saw the candidate who was strongest, that was the political outgroup candidate. So Republicans saw the Democratic candidate being stronger with a higher GPA and vice versa. So what did we find here? Both domain general intellectual humility and politics specific intellectual humility were weakly to moderately negatively associated with indices of partisan bias across the samples. So what this means really is that intellectual humility was related to less of a difference in ratings between Republican and Democratic conditions. And there was little evidence that there were political differences in these relationships. We looked at political party as a moderator, and it did not moderate these relationships. In terms of the embedded partisan cues, we wanted to see whether intellectual humility still was negatively related to partisan bias, even when the task at hand was not directly political. The relationships did not differ between Republicans and Democrats again, so we collapsed across participants. And both domain general and politics specific intellectual humility were moderately positively associated with selecting the more qualified political outgroup candidate, and that qualification was based on GPA. And interestingly, we found that intellectual humility was positively related to selecting the candidate based on academic achievement, as opposed to community involvement or extracurricular activities. And what this really suggests to me is that intellectual humility is associated with focusing on the task at hand, really being able to maybe put the political cues on a shelf and focus on what is the accurate thing in this space. So to summarize, intellectual humility was consistently negatively related to partisan bias. The relations held when partisan cues were explicit and embedded, and there was evidence for political symmetry in these relationships. So we also wanted to look at evidence evaluation in the absence of explicit partisan cues. So we're looking at political information that's not directly tied to a political party, and that's where bias assimilation comes into play. Participants rated the strength of their beliefs regarding 2 political issues, anthropogenic global warming and gun control. They were sorted into the condition that they felt the most strongly about. Either they strongly disagreed with the issue or strongly agreed with it. And sample sizes range from 163 to 263 participants based again on this sorting. Here is an example of what they read. There is considerable controversy about whether gun control laws increase risk for violent crime. Some scientists maintain that stricter gun control legislation increases violent crime rates. Others are unconvinced. There's more than enough evidence from scattered published studies that stricter gun control legislation is beneficial. Countries that have enacted stricter gun control legislation tend to have among the lowest rates of gun-related deaths. It seems likely that gun control legislation does consistently keep the public safe. So this isn't a really great argument. It's pretty vague. It's referring to like scattered evidence, maybe a couple of facts, and this is consistent across the perspectives, across the topics. After reading the argument, they would then go on to rate different things like perceptions of the author of the argument, how arrogant is this author to you, and how convincing you found the argument itself. We looked at perceptions of the author and the argument, openness to hearing about the author's perspective in person, and respect for that author's position. Again, we took different scores between the 2 conditions. The smaller the difference score, the smaller the bias assimilation. What did we find? Across topics and measures, intellectual humility was associated with less bias assimilation across all of those outcomes: argument bias, author bias, openness bias, and respect bias. This means there was less of a difference in ratings across the pro and anti arguments. Interestingly, domain general intellectual humility was not significantly related to argument bias for the global warming topic. So to summarize, again, intellectual humility was consistently negatively related to bias assimilation, with the exception of that global warming argument bias composite. And I actually think this is a nice finding. What I think this means is intellectually humble individuals may have shown a scientifically sound preference for arguments in support of anthropogenic global warming. And actually, intellectual humility was strongly positively related to supporting anthropogenic global warming. And this is consistent with arguments that bias is not always a bias and it's not always irrational. And it also aligns nicely, I think, with the results from the scholarship paradigm. Intellectual humility might really be related to keying in on accuracy. And finally, we also wanted to see whether these relations generalize to selecting political information in the first place. So participants rated the strength of their beliefs regarding two different political issues: universal healthcare and building a wall on the US-Mexico border. They were sorted into cognition again based on what they believed the most strongly about. So either strongly disagreeing or strongly agreeing. And sample sizes ranged from 203 to 260 participants. Here's examples of what participants read. I'm not going to read the subheadlines. I'm just going to focus on those titles. So for instance, providing healthcare for everyone offers a clear vision for the future of medicine in America. Or Democrats continue to cherry pick evidence on the benefits of universal healthcare, even though it will not help America progress. They had to pick at least one article, and they could pick as many as they liked. After seeing the headlines, they then indicated how many supportive versus disconfirmatory articles they selected in addition to the total. And what we found was across topics and measures, intellectual humility was associated with selecting fewer confirmatory articles, but we didn't find great support that it was associated with selecting more disconfirmatory articles. The only evidence we found was with politics-specific intellectual humility and only in sample 2. So to summarize these results, intellectual humility, again, was negatively related to selecting confirmatory information, but only politics-specific intellectual humility was related to selecting more disconfirmatory information. We also wanted to look at whether there are differences across the board between politics-specific and domain general intellectual humility, and we did find some evidence that politics-specific intellectual humility was a stronger correlate of less political myside bias than domain general intellectual humility. And this was especially the case for bias assimilation and selecting those disconfirmatory articles. And with regards to specificity, in aggregate, we found that IH bias relations did not significantly change after controlling for honesty, humility, political ideology, or political conviction. So you can see some of the results did change, but on average, it was less than 5% of the results. So now to summarize across all of these different relations and highlight some future directions. Intellectual humility manifested negative, although typically small, relations with political myside bias, even for issues that participants held with great conviction. In fact, we designed it to be that way. We specifically had people evaluate information that they felt the most strongly about, and we still see movement with intellectual humility there. And the relationships held across multiple measures of political myside bias that tap into different aspects of information processing. So it's partisan cues, it's evaluation of political arguments, and it's selection of political information. We also found that these relations span cognitive and relational domains, which I think is nice. I think we've heard from a lot of talks in this symposium that misinformation and evaluation of political topics isn't just this cognitive thing. There is a relational component. And we found that intellectual humility was negatively related to things like argument quality, but also things like respect for the author. The relations were relatively specific to intellectual humility and not those allied constructs that we might expect to have a lot of movement here as well, like what you identify as politically. And we found pretty consistent evidence for political symmetry in these relations, which to me seems to corroborate these intuitions that intellectual humility might be a relatively nonpartisan trait. These moderation results suggest that the relationships between intellectual humility and political myside bias did not vary across the left and the right. What I think remains an open question, however, is what does intellectual humility itself look like in the left and the right? I'm not sure if it's going to be the same. We also found that politics-specific intellectual humility again manifested relations with political myside bias that were significantly larger than domain general intellectual humility. And I think this can be interpreted in two ways that might not be mutually exclusive. The first is that politics-specific intellectual humility might be especially important for fairly evaluating your political beliefs. As we see in the broader personality literature, the more contextualized you get in your assessment of a trait, the more accurate it tends to be in predicting that outcomes tied to whatever you're specifically assessing. So we're specifically assessing political outcomes, assessing political humility. We would expect that to be a stronger relationship. It might be really important. However, politics-specific intellectual humility might reflect, at least partially, just low political conviction. Maybe I just don't feel that strongly about it compared with those who are less politically humble. And some studies have found that politics-specific intellectual humility is related to less political conviction. So I think in future research, it's going to be important to disentangle those two. What are we really assessing when we have people reflect on the level of humility they possess for their political views? Thank you so much again for having me and giving me this space to talk about these results. And I want to thank my co-authors and colleagues and my late PhD advisor, Scott Lilienfeld, for their contributions to this project. And if you have any questions, I have no problems with you reaching out. This is my Gmail, this is my Twitter, and this paper is currently available in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin. Thanks again, and I'll stop my share.
Terrific. Thanks, Shauna. Really appreciate that. If anyone has a question, you can just type Q in the chat. And Marco's first.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I wanted to ask you about general versus domain-specific intellectual humility, because I'm still suffering from Rick's talk, where he big picture found, no interesting relationships, this general intellectual humility, and all the fun is in the domain specific. I just wanted to make sure that I understood correctly what you found. So you found generally larger effects for domain specific, but there were also significant effects for general. Mm-hmm. And I would love to know more about how you measure domain specific intellectual humility, and when you ask people the humility questions, before or after diving into the content pieces.
So we used Rick's measure of domain-specific intellectual humility, specifically about politics broadly, not about a specific issue. So again, with general intellectual humility, you're having people rate how open are you to new perspectives? And it's not tied to anything, versus how open are you to different political perspectives? So that's how we measured it here. In terms of the survey battery, I think that's a great point, thinking about when people are rating these things. We did not think about that, honestly, for this project, and it was just kind of in the middle of the survey. So it was after some of the initial ratings for these paradigms, but before some of those last ratings. But it's possible that even taking a moment to self-reflect on your political views in that way, or reflect on your humility, might have some sort of effect.
It's super. That's super helpful. So it wasn't quite as devastating as it was in Rick's research. Okay.
It was definitely not. I think, again, as I alluded to in the talk, this is just consistent with all of personality psychology, if you will. If you're predicting work-related behaviors and you ask about openness to experience at work, it tends to be a stronger predictor. So it's not surprising that we're seeing that here as well. But I'm more optimistic, I think, than him about our ability to tap into domain general intellectual humility as well.
Thank you.
So I'm a little bit worried that some of the things you presented participants with involves a kind of both sidesism. So, when it comes to like climate change or gun control, like the there is a scientific consensus at this point. And you can say like, well, is the Earth round or flat? Democrats and Republicans differ on the question. Some say it is, some say it isn't. Here's an article that purports to show that the world is round, and here's one that purports to show that the Earth is flat. Which ones are you going to click on? And it's like, I don't know how much I can infer from someone's behavior in that kind of situation, because it seems like once there's a consensus, if someone knows the consensus exists, then it's reasonable for them both to ignore further evidence in its favor and to ignore alleged evidence against it. So can you tell me a bit more about how you constructed these the materials for some of these surveys?
Sure. First, I would say I agree with you very broadly. I think that's, what Jost and others talk about in terms of like, are we always assessing a bias, or is it always irrational? And that's probably not the case. In terms of constructing these measures, we pulled from like actual news articles, news headlines, what people write about on different policy websites for things like gun control and climate change, and we intentionally made it ambiguous. I think that would be interesting actually to look at whether the ratings provided for intellectual humility and these measures, whether intellectually humble individuals actually are rating them pretty unfavorably, because these arguments aren't great. They are wishy-washy. They are appealing to both sides. So I think that's why technically people should rate them similarly and ideally rate them kind of low in terms of their quality. But I definitely hear your point in terms of, if there is a consensus, maybe you should stick to that. And I think that also speaks to Anton's findings with like intellectual humility might sometimes be related to actually being more susceptible to misinformation, because you are really trying to see both sides, even maybe when you shouldn't.
Maria, you're next.
Yeah. So I have a slight concern about the way you were discussing political bias when it comes to political parties, because I think to be a member of a political party by definition is to subscribe to their platform. Otherwise you are not a member of that party. So if you become that sort of intellectually humble about other political parties, etc., the whole party system in the Western democracies will break down.
Yeah, I agree. I would say that it's not about partisan identification necessarily, but with partisan bias, it's favoring your own party for the same thing. So you read something like a Republican candidate supports X position, and then you read later a Democratic candidate supports the same position. And if you say like, oh, it's okay when the Republican does it, but it's not okay when the Democrat does it, that would be the bias, not the identification with the party itself. Absolutely.
But could it not be that you're thinking, well, if my candidate is supporting it, she must have better reasons for it than the other side, because the whole general framework to which I subscribe would justify her reasoning better than the other. There could be rational reasons why depending on what sort of explanation you have for a particular belief.
I would agree, especially I think the more specific information that you provide to participants. In general, these paradigms are intentionally ambiguous, where you're not referring to a specific candidate that exists in the real world. And that's one of the limitations of these paradigms. Like, do these results translate to actually ecologically valid paradigms like real world behaviors? That's definitely an open question. But absolutely, bias is hard to study, because I think there are a lot of rational explanations undergirding bias, and we have to find a way to tap into what is a bias, what is rational, does that even matter in this instance? And a lot of times it does matter.
Thanks. Thank you.
So I guess I'll turn it over to myself.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Shauna. Really appreciate it. Okay, so this is the final talk. Thanks to everyone who has stuck through thick and thin. I'm going to share my screen and get this party started. closing the chat. And here we go. Okay, so long title, boring title, but I think it's interesting work. A lot of the research on intellectual humility, at least in philosophy, comes from a very individualistic point of view. So the kinds of cases that initially people talk about will be like, you and your friend just had lunch, the bill comes, you both calculate the tip and come to different amounts that you should leave for the staff. You agree that it's supposed to be 15% or 20% or whatever it might be, but you've come to a different conclusion about how much 20% on top actually is. And what should you do in a situation like this? Should you stick to your guns, or should you conciliate, or should you engage in further inquiry, so on and so forth? And that's all very good, but a lot of disagreements arise not just in these kinds of dyadic relationships between two individuals, but also in the context of intergroup conflict. And as we heard in the first talk in today's symposium, the ways that people behave in intergroup conflict may differ in pretty important ways from the ways that they behave in within group conflict. And one of the things that I've been concerned about with the research on intellectual humility is that most of the measurement tools that we have available are very individualistic. So it's not just the philosophers who are individualistic, but also the psychologists. So what we set out to do was to look at all of the ways in which intellectual humility can be studied so far, and to examine both the commonalities and differences in them, and then also the extent to which they included anything about intergroup conflict. And we are basically trying to take this proliferation of ways of measuring intellectual humility, squeeze it down to the best items, and then also introduce some stuff to measure intergroup conflict. So can I move to the next slide, please? Right. So there's way too many ways of measuring intellectual humility. Let me just show you a few. So here's a scale that I helped develop. And I think Philip presented some results that use this to predict belief in conspiracy theories, medical misinformation, and things like that on one of the other symposium days. Here's another one that we developed, which no one seems to have used. Here's yet another one that has been developed by, among others, Heather Baddeley, who presented on the first day, and which I think was used by several of the empirical presenters on previous days. Here's yet another one. I think that Shauna may have used this one in her previous talk. Here's another one, which Shauna definitely used in the previous talk. Here's another one, which I'm also involved with, and which Marco presented from in a previous talk. Here's another one, and here's another one, and here's another one. And you might think, okay, this is getting a bit out of hand. We need to figure out, like, did we just create 10 different measures for the same thing? Are some of them better than others? Is there a way of condensing them? Is there a way of sort of finding a factor structure that among all the sort of most valuable items in each of them? And that's kind of one of the main things that this project is meant to do, is to address this proliferation. So if you're interested in this, you can see our pre-registration at the Open Science Framework. It's got a slightly different title from this talk, but it's basically the same idea. And one of the things that we're aiming to do is not just condense things down from that wild proliferation that I showed you, but also to introduce something about intergroup conflict. And I think this is really important because one of the things that we've found pretty consistently in our social epistemology research is that people display a sort of Janus-faced disposition in some cases. So when someone that they perceive as an ally disagrees with them, they actually draw closer to that person. So they tend to conciliate, they tend to change their minds and draw closer together. Whereas when someone who's perceived as an enemy or an adversary or just an outgroup member tends to disagree with them, they don't conciliate. In fact, they polarize. So you get this weird phenomenon where you get both depolarization within a polarity and polarization between the two main poles. So this is a network graph that we made based on some research into the discourse about vaccines on Twitter in the year 2020. Already before COVID hit, Democrats and public health were kind of allied, while anti-vaxxers and Republicans were kind of allied. But they were still somewhat distinct. And what happened after the pandemic really struck was that the Democrats and the public health crew drew closer together. So they didn't agree about everything, but they decided to agree more and more and to support each other more and more. Likewise, the Republicans and the anti-vaxxers drew together more and more. At the same time, the public health folks and the Democrats drew further away from the anti-vaxxers and Republicans who mutually also drew away from Democrats and public health. So what you see is not just a story of polarization and not just a story of conciliation, but a story of conciliation within a polarity and pulling apart between polarities. And that's something that is very hard to investigate if you have a measure of intellectual humility that doesn't account for intergroup conflict. So our solution was, let's draft up some new intergroup conflict items. And we ran a bunch of studies. I'll report on the first three. The others are in planning stages right now. The first one was just some NYU undergrads. Okay, fine. I understand there are questions about using generalizing from undergrads, but we also had just a huge number of items here, and we wanted to at least get a pilot off the ground. And here's the scree plot, so you can see probably there's a few factors that can be reasonably extracted, but hopefully not too many out of these items. And here's a solution that we found somewhat compelling. It includes items from a bunch of the scales that I described to you earlier. So the prefix here on the question refers to which scale it came from. And as you can see, the open-mindedness factor is drawing from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different scales. Right. So as I said earlier, if you've got 10 different scales, you might wonder, like, are we measuring the same thing with all of them? It looks like to some extent we are. So this open-mindedness thing, being open to others' ideas, seems to be figuring in a bunch of different scales. And you might think, well, we could probably like throw out most of these items and just pick the best ones. Likewise with intellectual arrogance, we're drawing from 1, 2, 3 different things, right? So that's fewer. These are mostly the ones from Marco Meyer's scale. We also found a factor for some kind of intellectual superiority. So like thinking that you're better than or smarter than or more informed than other people. And then something to do more with sort of emotionality and defensiveness. So getting upset when people disagree with you. So one of the things that is sort of obvious once you focus in on some of the items is that they're almost identical. And you might think, okay, we don't need to include identical items. That's just redundant. It artificially increases your alpha. And we could probably have a better scale if we can throw some of this stuff out. So that's what we did. We threw out some of the redundant stuff, and we also wrote some intergroup conflict items and then ran those with a group of participants from Prolific, larger sample, adults, in, if I recall correctly, both the US and the UK. And you can see the scree plot has a somewhat nicer shape here. It looks like maybe just a couple of factors are extractable. And in fact, they are. The first factor that comes out of this is intellectual arrogance. And I'll note that in italics, we have items that are from these new intergroup conflict, this new intergroup conflict set that we drafted up, and the others with plain font and the prefix 6 are all of the ones from the individualistic scales that I mentioned earlier. You'll see that we get a lot of the same things from Marco's scales here in the intellectual arrogance factor, but on top of that, we also get a ton of items that have to do with some kind of intergroup intellectual arrogance. So things like, I only listen to people who belong to my group. You should only trust the word of people who belong to your group. There's no point listening to the opinions of outsiders. I ignore people who aren't part of my group, and so on. And there's a little bit of redundancy here, of course, so we want to squash these down as well. But I think it's important to note that actually we get a ton of these intergroup items that are associated with, they load on the same factor as the the epistemic vice items from Marco's scale, but which you can't see, you can't measure unless you think of these things in the context of intergroup conflict. Likewise, with the open-mindedness factor, the ones with a 6 as a prefix, these are ones that should be familiar to us by now. We've seen these from a bunch of different scales, but the open-mindedness factor also includes several items from the intergroup conflict set. So that includes things like, when I disagree with someone who belongs to a different group, I always try to understand their point of view. Interaction between groups is important because everyone can learn from each other. Every group has nuggets of wisdom. So this has to do with open-mindedness, not just with like the one person I happen to be talking with already, who's more likely than not a member of my group in the first place, because why otherwise would I talk to them, but also with openness to outsiders, outgroup members, the opinions of people from other cultures, and so on. The other two factors that emerge in this study are, once again, intellectual defensiveness, so this sort of negative emotional reaction when people disagree with me. And interestingly, this factor included only individual items, individualistic items. So none of the intergroup conflict items loaded on this factor. That may have to do with how we wrote the items, so it's to be investigated further. But it also may just have to do with defensiveness somehow being a bit more individualistic. But in a way, what's most important is that an entirely new factor emerged, a kind of intergroup superiority factor. And this involves thinking that like somehow there's something special about my group, maybe due to our genetics, maybe due to our culture, but whatever it's due to, there's something special about us, and we're just smarter and better informed and better educated and more trustworthy than other people. So these items include things like, people from my group are more likely to be correct. People who don't belong to my group tend to be ignorant and stupid. People who belong to my group are smarter. People who belong to other groups are irrational. This is sort of like, you know, if you think of like your IQ fetish bros who think that like, you know, that they're just destined by God to be the smartest ones in the room because they just happen to belong to, say, like a racial group that's genetically superior. That's kind of what we're tapping into here, I think. And that's a certain kind of intellectual arrogance that's both quite common, I think, just from trolling around on the internet and seeing what people say, and also something that, despite the proliferation of 10 different ways of measuring intellectual humility, we don't have a single item that already measures that. So I think it's really important to both condense the set of items that we use and also to expand it in certain ways to address this issue, to address this kind of phenomenon, which hitherto has not been something we could measure. I see that I'm running a little low on time, so let me sum up the third study. This is again on prolific, and this was a replication of the pilot study with the NYU undergrads. So this was just the individual items once again. And basically we get the same factor structure with adults that we got with 19-year-olds at NYU. We get an open-mindedness factor, which is basically most of the same items. We get a defensiveness factor, which again has to do with people's emotional reaction to disagreement. We get a kind of arrogance factor, which once again mostly involves items from Marco's epistemic vice scale, and we get a superiority factor. So it seems like, okay, the individual items from these 10 different scales can be condensed probably to a 4-factor, maybe even a 3-factor structure. Once we introduce the intergroup conflict items, some of those factors will get a few additional things added to them, and we'll likely continue to see the intergroup superiority factor emerging as its own thing. So we're expecting that with a few more studies, we'll be able to crunch this down to maybe 3 or 4 factors with, say, 6 items on each of them. And that could be a tool that everyone could use going forward and not have to decide, like, oh, do I use the Leary this time? Do I use the one from Heather Baddeley's group? Do I use the one from Alfano's group? Which one do I use the Marco Meyer one? Instead, we'll just have one thing that works for everybody and has been validated in a number of ways. And what are those ways? Well, we want to draft up some intergroup items for defensiveness to see whether any of them load on it. It might turn out to be just a purely individualistic factor. It might also involve some intergroup element. We want to make sure that this new scale, this condensed scale, predicts things that matter. Given that it's using items from scales that we've heard about in previous talks that predict things that matter, we expect that it will, but it's always good to double check. As I said, we'll pare things down. We'll test for discriminant and convergent validity by checking the correlation with other established members, such as items from the Big Six, the cognitive reflection task, and so on. And then we'll finalize it. And then the sort of pie in the sky idea is to automate it by essentially, if I can get a big sample of the writing that you've produced, say every tweet you've ever created, or all of your emails, or everything you've posted on Reddit, whatever it might be, can I then predict, based on the language that you use, where you would fall on the intellectual humility scale, because that would enable us to use text rather than questionnaires, and would massively increase our sample size and enable us to sort of move forward much more quickly and less expensively. So thank you very much for your attention, and that's it. So I think Shauna's first. Yeah.
Yes, if it's all right, I might ask 2 questions, but it's really exciting to see this work finally being done. I've been waiting, I guess, to see someone try to collapse across these measures. That's really great. My first question is whether you're considering testing for measurement invariance across the left and the right, and whether you think that the factor structure itself might look different in conservatives and liberals, or Republicans and Democrats.
That's a good question, and I'm going to ask my co-authors whether they have ideas about that, because they're better at the psychometrics than I am. Philip and Jay, do you have any thoughts about that?
I think we're trying to explore it. I mean, I think our sample sizes are probably too small right now, but we are asking about ideology and party affiliation in all the samples. So hopefully, at least maybe across the studies, we'll be able to do it. And yeah, but it'll be super interesting, especially with regard to the group items, and also with regard to the group items that Mark presented. So study 2. One thing that we're also doing is we're asking all participants to tell us what groups they were thinking of, both as in groups and out groups when they were responding. And we still haven't done anything useful with that, but people are giving interesting groups. I mean, quite a few, of course, are giving the usual political group suspects, but they're also quite interesting contrasts that are popping up there. And with large enough samples, so once we get into the more validation part of the scale, and we get thousands of participants, hopefully we'll be able to do something with that as well, and see if we can relate some of the submeasures to, people, so some people go, the kin route, some people go the political route, some people celebrity route. I mean, and what kind of relations they're constructing. But right now, we don't have anything more interesting to say than hopefully we will have something interesting to say in a few months.
That's great to kind of look into like a potential reference group effect. If I can sneak in one last question, sorry, is whether you think this scale could be adapted for an informant report purpose, because I can imagine if you had like a task where 2 people were actually interacting with one another, to be able to rate how the person interacts in that group. I don't know if you have thoughts about that. Yeah,
so the scale that I helped develop does have an informant report version. It's somewhat validated. We didn't have a huge sample to help validate it. The thing is that with informant report stuff, sometimes it's very easy to just rewrite the item as like something about someone else, and sometimes it's not. So I think part of what's going to happen is, we have to see what the finalized items look like. And if they're ones that could be easily rewritten, then we can create an informant report version. If they're not, it becomes more challenging. So I guess the answer is maybe. Sorry. Just to speak to the thing Philip said, though, one thing I noticed just scrolling through the in-groups and out-groups that people identified was some interesting differences in the in-groups. So a lot of people will refer to their in-group as like my friends and family, right? So very tight circle, but a lot of them would refer to their in-group based on like their race or their religion or where they lived or their citizenship. Whereas with out-groups, it was almost all stuff like race, nationality, religion, politics. That's almost all of it, actually. So interestingly, gender didn't figure into it, even though probably it should, but maybe people are just blind to the way that they sort of form cliques based on gender. So we'll have to see with more data what goes on with that. I think Maria is next.
Okay, is it working? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So one question I had was about reaction to criticism, and how did you characterize the humility virtue of it, or arrogance of it? So is that defensiveness? Yeah, is that what yeah?
That's the label we put on it.
Yeah, okay, but this is just based on my life experience, which is quite long compared to most people here. I associate defensiveness with not with intellectual arrogance at all, or epistemic arrogance, but in fact lack of self-confidence. Some of the most intellectually arrogant people I knew were not at all defensive, because they were just so, they would take the criticism and say, okay, right, yeah, I was wrong, but I'm right in so many other respects that what do I care? While people who are very insecure about themselves and show humility in other areas take the criticism so much in heart that they become defensive. So I'm just, based on my own personal life story, I don't see defensiveness as a sign of intellectual arrogance or not being intellectually humble. So I just wanted to see what you said.
Yes, so I guess the way I was thinking of it was that there's a way of being arrogant where you have very high self-esteem, you're just very self-assured, and you breeze past any kind of disagreement. Doesn't affect you at all.
Yes. Yeah.
And then there's a kind of insecure, or think of someone who's arrogant, but they have like a inferiority complex, as it were. And whenever they're challenged, they kind of freak out. That also is a kind of arrogance, I would say, but it's a very different kind. It is also a way of shutting down discourse, right? So if you're trying to say like, no, look, there's counter evidence, and I just have this wild emotional reaction, then we're no longer talking about the evidence. We're not trying to reach some kind of consensus. Now you have to just like tend to my emotions. So I think that there is a way that this can be quite pernicious in an epistemic context, but we can follow up further about whether it's right to call it arrogance.
Yeah. So yes, that, and then just one more quick point on conspiracy theories. So this is one of the issues that I'm quite concerned about in the debates about conspiracy theory, because where I grew up in Iran and in most of Middle East, conspiracy theories are just run of the mill, but they have nothing to do with intellectual arrogance, none whatsoever, or any of these. It's just because of the political structures that you don't trust those in authority. So whatever they say, you try to find an alternative explanation. Most of these alternative explanations have to do with those in power, doing things in ways that are beyond our reach, etc. So conspiracy theories are motivated by very different political and also psychological forces, and just to align them with arrogance, I think it's just empirically wrong if you think of conspiracy theory as something that applies everywhere. If you go to Egypt right now or to Palestine right now, it has nothing to do with their arrogance, but something else altogether.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, if you are living in a situation where trustworthy information is very hard to find, then conspiracy theorizing starts to become more reasonable.
That's right. And it becomes a political gesture, actually, a respected political gesture. Or they are not telling us the truth, so let's guess what the truth is. So
yeah, no, that's a fair point. So we were polling people who do have trustworthy sources available, but may not be availing themselves of those trustworthy sources. But that's an interesting point about the generalizability of this kind of research to places where the media ecosystem is even less trustworthy than in the States.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Let's take one last question from Marco and then wrap things up.
Finally, a consolidated scale. So exciting. What will really matter for how you're selecting items, I suppose, is the outcome measures. So this is also about that. Now that you have these great new intergroup conflict items, wouldn't it be cool to have an outcome item like the one that we're about today, but also in the last session around how people change their minds when confronted with evidence and make that quite central, and perhaps really see from the community what other kind of things they suspect are associated with intellectual humility, and be really broad and including a bunch of stuff and seeing which items are relatively robust, or whether we need perhaps 2 or 3 different versions depending on what type of outcomes you want to study, because that should be the deciding factor, I think, in the end, what relates to outcomes.
Yeah, that's nice. So there's a couple ways to do that. One is to let people answer a question, show them some evidence, see whether they change their minds. And the evidence would have to involve whether it's coming from an in-group member versus an out-group member. Another way would be to use something like the Dan Kahan motivated numeracy approach, where you've got a problem that can be solved, that there is a correct answer, but it requires a significant amount of intellectual effort that a lot of people are not willing to engage in, and see whether we can predict outcomes with that. I think largely the factor structure is going to be driven by the factor analysis, but which precise items from among some of the more seemingly redundant ones make it into the final scale, that would be worth considering what kind of outcomes they're especially associated with. Thanks. And thanks everybody. I really appreciate your time and your attention. And this is going to be up on YouTube in the coming days or weeks. And so please advertise that if you're willing. And hope to see you all in person one of these days.